Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to today's webinar. We're doing exploits, all things exploits, which is my favorite topic. Anyone who's somewhat familiar with my game knows I like to go off script. And I want to cover a bunch of different things today: soft exploits, hard exploits, kind of the definition of exploits, because I think there's a lot of confusion about that too. And it means something different to different people. But while people are trickling in, we will start with a hand. This was a kind of fun hand I played in a 3500. This was a WPT at Hard Rock. Let me tee it up for us. And it is right here. So let me just make sure everyone's seeing Queen 6 of diamonds. Good. This was a low stakes pro here in seat 4, and seat 8 was a super nit. So I'm going to widen my range here, specifically with some extra calls. Not necessarily looking to play huge pots out of position here and lower the SPR when I feel I have a post-flop edge. But I think this is a spot where we can expand a little bit pre-flop. And you see me doing that right away with Queen 6 suited. Just to take a quick look, here's what Wizards got us doing pre-flop. Queen 8 suited bottom. I don't think this is going to be too much of a stretch if you imagine that the big blind is skipping a lot of these bluffs and that you have a post-flop edge against both players. I think that 10.3% 3-bet, that squeeze is pretty high for a lot of nits. And I had this guy as a super nit who I thought was like probably about 30% to squeeze pocket tens. So we're just going to get to the flop too often, and that's going to really help us out. So question I have for people right off the bat, would love input from the chat, is how are you playing the hijack spot in terms of bet frequency? If you're check 2 here, are you betting range, half of range, 80%? And are you playing one size, two sizes? What do you like? Just to refresh the situation, he's about 65 big blinds deep. I'm sorry, we go heads up, by the way. I'll let answers trickle in for a moment. Yeah, J-Rob, this is not the normal background. I'm in the house right now. That's the office, but the office has had shaky internet, so didn't want to drop the internet in a webinar. Okay. Couple answers coming in. Half range, two sizes, small and mid, 40% frequency bet, big and check, pretty close to range for 1/3 pot. Might check back hands like kings, weak ace X, 65 range. Yeah. The idea I get is that a lot of people are playing a lot of small bet and check here in seat 4. I think some of that bigger bet is coming in. If we take a quick look here at what Wizards doing, you've got 40% check, a lot of small betting, a little bit of mid betting here. Click on the 55. You can see top candidates, ace, king, ace, queen, makes a lot of sense. But then there's a lot of balance that I think is relatively tricky to find. I think people have their kind of preferred bluffs. I think maybe like a king 4 of diamonds makes sense to a lot of people, but I'm not sure a lot of people who play B55 on the flop here are going to use the king 4 of hearts. Not sure if they're going to use the queen 9 no backdoor. Maybe a 10-9 of spades. Diamonds, certainly, maybe 4s, 2s. I do think it's really difficult to balance this. Not to mention, not everyone has the Jack 7 suited, 10-7 suited here. My point being, I think it's really easy to play way too strong. If we take a look, GTO Wizard, when you move it up to 80 big blinds, they're pretty much not playing a bigger bet. They're playing small bet and check. And again, the major point I want to kind of put in play here is that I think it's super difficult to properly balance the bigger size. And then especially if you're playing a tournament where you think you have a pretty big edge. And even though this guy is a low stakes pro, I imagine he thinks he's got at least a double-digit ROI in this tournament. And he probably does. It's a soft WPT tournament. And with that in mind, I'm probably not his favorite candidate to launch a raging bluff and go 3 streets starting with a big size. So I do think that that kind of detracts a lot of people from playing a big size right off the bat. And in this hand, I'm going to talk about why I think that's problematic and why I think if you're not going to play balanced on the later streets, you should probably just chill in the first place and start with a lot of small bets and check. So that's what the guy does. He bets 60%, and that's why I'm kind of getting into this hand, is I feel like I'm picking up way too much info right away. I feel like it doesn't have to be an ace or better, but it's very unlikely that it's a weak ace. It's very unlikely that it's kings, queens, jacks. It's very unlikely that it is some garbage bluff like king seven of clubs. I think we're looking at a lot of equity, and I'm going to play pretty passive here. I would play almost no check raise except for pocket threes and pocket eights, to be honest. Turn the flush, and if you follow what I'm saying, it kind of looks like a good spot to donk, but I think that's overextending. I think even though we put him on a lot of value, this would be a really difficult line to balance with bluffs, and I think he could wise up and make some pretty strong folds, like maybe ace queen no diamond by the river if I start donking right away. And I think if we donk a small size, it's rather purposeless, because the difference between B33 and checking, where we let him bet sometimes, and it's going to be a lot more than B33, is definitely in the favor of checking. And launching a big bet here is just very, very sus. So I wouldn't go that far. So I check. He tanks for about 15 seconds and checks. It looked pretty genuine to me. He had some quick actions. Certainly timing matters with people when they have multiple speeds in situations where there should be some level of thinking. So I think a lot of players do have snap checks here and do have tank checks. I'm not going to read too much into it, except to say that there's a decent chance he does have a thinker. River is a 9, and I asked this question in the GTO Lab Discord and got a lot of different answers. So I'm going to ask it again, give about 20 seconds for some answers to trickle in. What do you guys like? Block, check, big bet, medium bet? Give me a size if you're betting. Let's hear what people like. So we've got 11-5, B125, big bet, check raise, brother. Skip the block and check. All right, around 2/3 pot. I'm going to agree with Ryan. Let's skip the block and check. Here's my issue. I think he has a good hand. I don't think we're looking at ace-4 of clubs because of that big bet on the flop. It just does not really look like that. If it's a bluff, certainly we want to check. But I don't think it's a bluff all that often either, because I think a lot of the bluffs from the flop are going to be diamonds, which he doesn't have after he checks a turn, or they're going to involve one big diamond. I block the queen of diamonds. The king of diamonds arrived. I mean, it could be like king jack with the jack of diamonds. It could be queen jack with the jack of diamonds. But I would think outside of the one that pairs the turn, the king X, we're going to see that diamond bet on the turn. I think if he was blasting the flop with fours, he's probably going to find that turn pretty irresistible to bluff. So with that in mind, I think he's got a lot of value. I'll pause and take a look at GTO Wizard, how they're seeing the situation. So on the flop, if we give him the B55, small blind is responding like this. And already I'm going to suggest some pretty big differences. I don't think it's worth it to call your fours with a diamond, your fives with a diamond, your sixes with a diamond. These are the hands that, yes, they're going to want to turn into a bluff on a run out like this, but I don't think it's going to be all that successful, because part of their value is folding him off of nothing because he just has nothing, and or getting to showdown, you know, when it bricks out and your sevens just happen to beat his king four of hearts or whatnot. But if you follow my read on the flop and we think that it's pretty imbalanced towards value and high equity, just overfold to begin with. The problem is, of course, that does leave you with a real lack of bluffs later on, which I think is what's happening. I think a lot of people are properly implementing this initial exploit that I'm kind of suggesting, which is just overfold. This is a big bet, and I think a lot of people are kind of cheating and making the small bet on the flop with a lot of their low equity hands and big betting a lot more ace, king, ace, queen. We go to the turn. And you can see when the king comes down, he's playing, you know, pretty linear. This is a lot of mid-size bet and a lot of check. But again, I don't think this is very reflective when you look at, like, let's say, you know, it's the Jack 10-0, Queen 10-0, Queen Jack-0. These are the bluffs he's going to need to have to kind of add up and find combos. We're looking at a real lack of combos. So you want to look at the offsuit hands, see where he's grabbing bluffs from. It's really tough to find. I do think the player who fires the fours on the flop, like I said, is going to fire the turn. The tank check has me thinking certainly not a flush, but probably something right in here. Probably less likely ace king, ace queen, ace jack. Ace queen kind of fits the bill perfectly, which, spoiler, that's what he ends up having, is ace queen with the ace of diamonds. And the reason I think it fits the bill perfectly is it's very enticing to make that big bet on the flop. You know, you have the best one pair hand. I'm never going to have a better ace in the small blind. So where you're down at ace 10, sometimes you're maybe giving a little too much money to ace jack. And up at ace king, I think that you're betting the turn fairly often, as solver is too. I mean, it's betting both of them. Point being, I think once he checks the turn, we're really zeroing in on this group right here. Definitely not saying it's impossible he checks pocket eights or pocket threes on the turn. But yeah, we go to the river, and you can see, obviously, my hand is not here, the queen 6 suited. I think queen 9 of diamonds, maybe even queen 10 of diamonds are reasonable correlates. The difference in these strategies, I think, without diving too deep, comes down to the fact that solver believes, you know, our opponent still has some ace 9 here. And if they have ace 9 and we happen to block, they're still going to, anything. If we block or we check, they're going to put in a lot of money. Whereas here, we don't think they have as much two pair. We think supposedly they're more ace 10 oriented, among other things. So just put the money in yourself. But again, I don't think that that's real. I think that's kind of fake in the situation. I would be very surprised if our opponent has ace 9. But all besides the point, this strategy, they're kind of giving you no guidance. You can do anything. But my theory is, if he's very ace queen and ace king oriented, if I big bet, he's going to call. If I check, I don't see how he makes a check. Certainly not with ace king. Ace queen with a diamond, I doubt it. Ace queen without a diamond, I still think he's going to bet. And if he happens to have a bluff, and all my assumptions are wrong here, of course we want to check to that too. But I do worry, one of the general exploits with river sizings that I would say kind of works across the board until you get to the really highest levels, or you're playing against someone with a strong heads up background, is that people don't raise your blocks and mid-size bets light enough for value. Some people over bluff. So it's not to say you never want to block a really good hand on the river or find a middling size. But in general, and especially with low and mid stakes players, once you put in money on the river, they don't raise often enough or large enough with their value. So I do think, you know, as Ryan pointed out, let's skip the block. That would really worry me. I think if we go B10, it gets really fishy and somebody kind of feels okay about calling ace queen. But if you check to them, I think they're going to have a lot of trouble not launching money in with ace queen. They're going to feel pretty bad about it. I think there's, to be honest, an embarrassment factor. Even though you can see solver without a diamond is checking here a lot. And that's worth noting because they believe the small blind has a lot of hands that I don't think we should really have, these low pocket pairs. So yeah, that's what's going on there. So I end up checking. He fires, was it right around this? Take a quick look. Fires 11K. I shove, and he pays me off with the ace of diamond offsuit queen, which, if I recall, Wizard doesn't really like this call much. It looks pretty intuitive to me. I think realistically, this is probably his best bluff catch. I mean, yes, I could have pocket nines and some other hands making this move. So maybe, you know, in solver land, there are better calls than this. But in reality, I empathize with his position here. I think he's saying, okay, I capped myself when I checked the turn. Just not true in solver land. They are checking some flushes, but in practice, I don't think people are, or most people are not checking flushes on the turn. And he's saying I have to be able to call something because he knows I don't have a flush. And I think the idea is if I blast the river, not check, but just open up with a B150. I'm not saying he's going to fold this hand, but maybe without a diamond, maybe he folds an ace queen of clubs or something because he's really struggling to find bluffs. He might project onto me accurately that I wouldn't have called him with pocket fours or fives when he went B66 or B60 on the flop, in which case there's a problem. But when I check the river, maybe he can put me on the king queen with a queen of diamonds. Maybe he can put me on the 8-7 suited, 8-6 suited. It's pushy. And then the last thing is turning an ace into a bluff. It's really ballsy, and I'm not going to have much in the way of offsuit. But if I'm facing this bet size, I ought to know that ace 10, and certainly with a diamond, is not beating any value, and possibly even ace jack isn't beating any value. So, you know, he can talk himself into that happening. But I do believe it's a lot easier to imagine that I'm check raising a bluff than it is to imagine I'm actually just leading with a bluff. Anyway, take a quick look at how they're playing it here. It was pretty much this bet. My hand shoving. And you can see their calls are kind of all over the place. In theory, you know, when I have pocket nines, that makes sense for a lot of my value. All right, I'm going to take a quick look at some of these questions, see if anything's coming in. And then now that we've had a minute for people to come into the webinar, I'm going to start with a quick 5-minute, probably around 10 minutes, PowerPoint talking about exploits, and then we'll get back to the hands. Planning to upload the stream to the channel for later reviewing. Yes, this will be on the YouTube, and this will also be on the GTO Lab platform. This is the first in a 2, maybe 3-part series on exploits. This one is free, and then the others are just going to be on the platform for subscribers to GTO Lab, our coaching videos. It says if the villain was a hijack, if the villain in the hijack was the super nit and the big blind, would you let him bet river? Would you donk? So if I understand correctly, we're talking about the opener being the super nit, in which case I think I would have folded pre. I think that if it was the pro on my left, he's going to find some of these squeezes. He's going to know that I'm going to want to flat pretty wide here, so I would have folded. But if I got to that situation and I'm facing the super nit, no, I would still check, because I think still super nits, as I'm defining here, are going to feel pretty hesitant to check back this group. But as a generalization, I do like the idea of putting the money in yourself against nits. Don't trust them to put the money in for you, both because they don't have enough bluffs and because, yeah, sometimes they could check back some really strong hands. So as a generalization, I would be putting in more big bets on the river against the nit there and less checking. But in this specific scenario, I don't think it would change my play. All right, let me jump to this little presentation I have. I am no good with PowerPoint, but my girlfriend set this up for me. All right, all things exploits. So quick riff about exploits, because I think they mean something different to different people. Let me take a quick look and make sure. Oh, no, we're good. I'm sharing. There are like massive exploits where you're, you know, folding jacks pre in a spot that a solver would never do it, where the solver's going with tens, but you open, someone 3-bets, someone 4-bet shoves, and even with no ICM in play, you're just saying, this is dead. And I think experience can kind of help you in those situations where you're just going way off course because your opponents are not capable in one direction or another. You'll get, I mean, I have an example of that actually from a recent tournament where, I mean, it was 100K, but the player on my right is a recreational who's trying to run up a stack. He's very honest about it. And UTG1 opens, and this recreational who just lost 3/4 of his stack, there's only 4 hands left in the day, and he flats the button off of 23 bigs. And I have 18 in the small blind with king jack offsuit. I'm just ripping there because that player is putting more money than a flat in with anything that's beating king jack O, is my opinion at this stage. He's just looking to gamble and shove anything. And he is going to call me off very light in this situation, and I'm going to get in some great spots. Not to mention, I'm not positive how much the UTG1 opener is thinking about that. But anyway, yeah, first guy folds, second guy instantly shows me 5-4 offsuit and is still thinking about calling and ends up folding for the reason that he would have been left with 5 big blinds and not bust to be able to re-enter right away had he called and lost. So, those kinds of things emerge, and that's one type of exploit. They're really important, but they're not most of what we're talking about with exploitative approach. I think a lot of exploits, it's going to be tweaks to your game plan, combo usage, river frequency, things like I was talking about on the flop there. I was kind of saying about the player who ends up having ace queen on that last hand that he probably should play a more balanced strategy. But if you don't respect the player in my spot, you can imbalance it, and you can kind of make your flop bluffs a certain group of hands and not balance it across the board. So that's really, to that end, I think we're all playing exploitative poker, just to various degrees. And probably in our lifetime, everyone's going to continue to play exploitative poker. But there is this kind of dichotomy that emerges between exploitative players and GTO players. Less so today. I think now, even the very well-studied players will tell you that they're not trying to follow the solver to a T. But it's important to differentiate between frequency exploits, sizing exploits, and just going completely bonkers in one direction, whether it's being a super nit in a spot because you don't believe your opponent has a fold, or sorry, you don't believe your opponent has any bluffs, or you're going to way over bluff somebody because whatever reason you think that they care too much about caching, or that they can't check raise you on the flop, so you over c-bet, that sort of thing. All right. So exploits are not timeless. This is very important. I think a lot of coaches, a lot of the good content that's available shies away from exploits for the reason that it's not going to be right in a year or 2 years or 3 years. A lot of what a player, a lot of what somebody is suggesting, it changes. The meta evolves really quickly. And not only that, but it's not like it just fades and stops being effective. There's this inflection point where I guess it's neutral for 1 minute. But if you imagine like a tennis ball going over the net, it's only at this kind of static point for 1 second. It was going up, and now it's going down. And that's what happens with exploits is as the counter exploits get developed, you start getting scorched. So an example that comes to mind for me, I put 4-bet bluffing in the early to mid 2010s. It was crushing for a moment, and then it became pretty costly when you overdid it. But another one that comes to mind for me is opening off of like 8 to 12 big blinds from any position. There was a period when no one except for exploitative players was ever opening off 9 or 10 big blinds. And the players who were doing that, by and large, were extraordinarily oriented towards bluffs. And they were kind of taking advantage of the fact that there was a group of players who still kind of felt the need to raise aces and maybe kings off of, let's say, 10 big blinds, but didn't raise any bluffs. So if you know that you're facing an opponent like that, obviously 3-bet bluffing them close to ATC is the counter exploit. But then you open yourself up to players knowing that you're doing that, and maybe someone behind attacks you. But point being, exploits are not timeless. Be aware that whatever is your kind of printing press today may cost you greatly soon. And that's why, my sales pitch for a lot of people is don't just learn these quick hack exploits that, here's what the data says right now. This is the best bet size on the flop, or when you 4x pre-flop instead of 2.5, you get way more folds than you should, so therefore X, Y, or Z. These things can be effective and helpful, especially in lower and mid stakes for a period of time, but they really hold back the growth of the player. All right, I'll move it along. Don't be afraid of mistakes. Try new lines, make mistakes, break stuff. Getting great at poker means opening up your mind to different ways of thinking. So, we're not doctors. It's not the Hippocratic Oath. You're going to do some harm sometimes. You're going to screw up. You're going to make mistakes. And if you're never making mistakes, well, you are. But if you are trying to play poker in an avoidant fashion, trying not to blunder constantly, you may do well in that scoring system, but you probably won't become a great poker player. When you think about the guys who really crush, I mean, just look at some of the best players when they've been on their sun run. If you take, a Fedor and Adamo, Justin Bonomo, Dan Coleman, these guys had some hands where people were snickering and talking mad shit about them because when it didn't work, it looked really bad. But they're great players and they were crushing. So let the other people snicker. That just kind of comes with the territory, and don't be afraid. Let me see. Oh, no. Yeah, the slides are not changing. Thank you. Let me. Exploits are not timeless. See if this works. All right, yeah, I'm going to have to leave it up like this. So yeah, catch up on those slides real quickly. So the other thing I wanted to say with regard to don't be afraid of mistakes, and this is something that I think is correcting itself in the population today, but solvers can become a crutch for players who are uncomfortable with uncertainty. But just like each individual poker hand, the path to playing great poker is a path of incomplete information. We don't know exactly what we should be doing. We don't always know the most efficient use of our time. And I think the solver can provide some illusions that this is what is correct. And if you make a mistake in solver land, it's easy to be hard on yourself. But most of your mistakes, you're not really going to know. You kind of have to solicit a bunch of opinions, and a mistake that the solver liked, is no less of a mistake than a GTO mistake. So not sure if I'm explaining myself all that well, but supposedly there is going to be a perfect play. Most of us agree the perfect play is not what's going to appear if you just plug it into PO. We think if you could node lock perfectly, then you could see some perfect solutions. But the fact is, nobody's node locking perfectly. We're making our best guesses. But my point is, the mistakes that you make that theoretically Equilibrium likes the play you made, they're still mistakes, and they can be extraordinarily costly mistakes. But I think a lot of people in today's day, they're not as hard on themselves about those mistakes as the ones where they're just kind of completely off chart and something doesn't work out. So essentially, I'm saying kind of give yourself a little bit of forgiveness sometimes on the ones that aren't appearing, and watch out for kind of letting yourself off the hook too much. I have a lot of students say like, yeah, I looked it up and GTO Wizard liked my play. I don't love it, but they take a lot of solace in it being there. And sometimes that's fine. They were right. But other times, no, it was a huge mistake. Don't overrate the success of your exploits. So when an exploit succeeds, and I'm taking a jab at our boy Ponikov's here, but I could just as easily put my face here, the feedback is intoxicating. When you win chips in creative ways that Equilibrium would not be doing, it's super rewarding. I think it inflates your ego, does for mine anyways, and it's a very enjoyable feeling, I find, to know that I won a pot in a way that 9 out of 10 other players wouldn't have done this. Especially, when you just kind of like soul read somebody, and yeah, Equilibrium doesn't like what you've done at all, but you kind of just had it supposedly pinpointed start to finish. We all know that the feedback of 1, 2, 20 hands is nothing in poker, but I think that the story takes over in a lot of our heads at that point, and makes it really difficult. All right. Jump to the next one. Exploitative strategies require an extra layer of mental toughness. So this kind of comes with the territory. This is one of the most mentally tough motherfuckers I know. Takes a lot of mental toughness and resiliency to regroup after you lose chips in a manner that most of your peers would never have lost them. I can remember I was playing in a big private cash game for a few years, and yeah, when I won 100K pot that I feel confident no one else would have played like me, I felt amazing. And conversely, I would come home sometimes and tell my girlfriend, I'm like, I lost 120 today, and I'm pretty confident nobody else in that game would have lost 30 with the cards that I had. And that just, that's part of it. And it's really painful when you kind of feel out on an island like that when things don't work out. So you really need a lot of confidence to kind of come back. So I said striking the right balance between humility and open-mindedness and toughness and resilience is a constant battle. And what comes to mind for me is that a lot of players, and I've definitely been guilty of this in my career, who play very exploitative, they develop a hard shell because a lot of people don't understand what you're up to, and sometimes that's because you know better, and other times it's not. Other times you're just off in la la land. I've been guilty of making a bunch of assumptions that are just wrong, and my exploit was not a good one. But either way, I think you open yourself up to a lot of criticism, and this balance that I'm talking about is really tricky to remain open-minded, hear the critics, hear from people who you think, their opinions are worth more than your own, and solicit a lot of opinions and try to stay humble. But at the same time, you don't want to crack and just give up on exploits because you've had a few not go your way. So said when your read is wrong and a large deviation proves costly, it can be a lonely world. It's easy to feel excessive despair, self-condemnation, or conversely, to feel defensive and smug. That's kind of the spectrum that I'm seeing, at least in my own experience. I've definitely felt on both extremes here, and neither one is particularly helpful, I think. So the inverse of this is that equilibrium strategies and randomizing, or claiming to have done so, because I think a lot of people like to lean on that when a play doesn't work. They say they rolled for it. It can provide an emotional safety net for a player, keeps them from feeling especially accountable for a poor result in a hand. And I'm not just knocking that. I really do think overall it's something to get past. But in the end, we make money not just by getting better at this game, but by being at the table. And there's something to be said for if you are, just feeling sliced open every time a river bluff doesn't go well, your longevity in this game, whether it's days per year you play or years in total that you play, is going to go down. I think that it's really difficult when you're refiguring out the game, you're overthinking maybe sometimes almost every hand while you're at the table. The game can be really taxing. So players who kind of lean into this, I think there's a lot of online players, especially people who play in lower stakes games than they need to, because they're comfortable and they want to be comfortable. I think they find themselves in this a lot where it's kind of this safety net that keeps you at the table. So I'm not completely knocking it, but I do think that, and additionally for self-development, I think it's good to try to let that safety net go and be comfortable with the pain of going for it and it not working. So I want to play more exploitative. What should I do? And I said, do not stop studying theory. That's the thing, is theory is the bedrock from which all the exploits should be built. Studying theory is also very time efficient. I won't get into this too long, but people who don't know theory and call themselves exploitative players are just ignorant. They might be doing some good things, but no, they don't know if they're exploiting or not. I can tell you that before I studied much at all, I often would say, usually to Nick Petrangelo, like, oh, this is an exploit I really like. And then he'd be like, yeah, I think that's pretty good, but also I think that's just how theory plays. And then he'd look it up and show me, and I wasn't exploiting at all. Which is not the worst thing by any means. But the point is, understand what your own game looks like, and understand what the game looks like at equilibrium. And even if you're playing in really wild games, it'll give you a good baseline from which to deviate. Observe and report. Keep notes on bets, sizes, and checks that players at your table make that you wouldn't have. I've got two hands in here in the presentation today that we'll go through really quickly that are just observed hands. I tend to take a lot of notes on hands, even that don't go to Showdown, just when I see something that looks peculiar to me, especially if it's a player I don't know at all, especially if it's a player that I can't tell if they're professional or not. Very helpful information. Look those hands up later in solvers, discuss them with peers, better poker minds, a coach. Think through the implications of some of these lines, what they may say more broadly about this player and their approach. I think a lot about like stereotyping and the idea that, we're all making judgment calls in life all the time. If you let, your quick glance at somebody and let's say how they dress completely dictate your opinion of them, you're probably pretty foolish to do that. But also, there is a little bit of information to be had right away. If you see a watch that looks like it is a $500,000 watch on somebody's wrist, that provides you some amount of information. And so you do want to start by kind of having this two-dimensional picture of people, and then you want to build it more and more 3D as you kind of get to know them and their play a little bit more, and you have them classified as more than just a nit or a lag. Said use yourself as a practice dummy. I think this is a good way for a lot of people who are not used to thinking about exploits and kind of figuring out like, how do I go about crafting them, is you know your own game better than anyone. So think about the playbook to beat you, what it might look like. Maybe put yourself in a couple people's skin and say like, all right, if I'm playing against a top pro, what would the top pro, if they had all the info on me, what would be their best ways to exploit me? And then maybe put yourself in the skin of someone who looks pretty nitty and recreational and say, how do you think, you know, that player would get the best of you? But it just kind of starts the brain going in the right direction, I think. All right, I'm going to take a look, see if we have any questions, comments that need responding to. Give me a moment, please. Yes, I agree, John. Mike Matisow definitely makes being a poker pro look very stressful. Is it possible to download the PowerPoint? I am not the guy to ask, unfortunately. I know nothing about PowerPoint, but I can ask somebody afterwards and see if we can put that out there. But actually, I mean, this video will be here, so you'll just be able to look at the PowerPoint on the video on YouTube. Thanks, Nick. Glad to hear it. All right, looking back a bit. I will never be robotic. Just trying. You probably won't think enough about what real people do. I think it's more about feeling, accepting as part of poker player's life. Sounds right to me. All right, let's get back to the hands. So this next hand, this is a fun one. This was a 10K at the win. It was not the WPT championship. What was this? I don't know, but it was a large field. It might have been the 10K that Nikki P won. That was like 2.8 for first or something. Not sure. But yeah, so about this villain, so we need to talk about her. She was maybe 35 to 45. I didn't remember ever seeing her before. This is a 10K buy-in, so, you know, there's randoms, but there's not, you know, it's a higher price point where I don't think you see just kind of random super nits. And she had multiple really good pros come over to her and chat briefly. It didn't seem like they were giving advice necessarily, but she definitely knew some high stakes pros. That was my experience to this point. And then we had played together for maybe 3 orbits, and she'd been relatively tight. I hadn't seen a showdown from her, and I had been very active. That's where we're at. So question I have for you guys is low jack versus big blind. We're looking at 80-ish big blinds deep. What frequency are you betting from the low jack? Are you range betting this? Are you finding any checks? What do people like in this situation? Give that a minute. All right, we're seeing a lot of range bet come in. Adam said more polar on this flop. High frequency 70 to 80, fine with 20% check. So GTO Wizard range bets the situation, which I think is pretty common for a lot of people. I think somewhere between range and 80%. Because they range bet it, I brought it up as cutoff to see what that situation looks like. Here it's a 23% check. This is not actually a good way to do this, though. I just know that some people will do something like this when they find that that there is a range check a range bet, and your player has checked back. The problem with this is obviously we're wider, so you're going to see a bunch of hands in here that's like king two suited, for example, my hand, that hijack is just not opening. So it's going to throw off the later stages as well. But what I really think is the problem is that if it's a situation where you believe your opponent is, do I have this up on the, no. If I didn't expect a check back here. I thought, I forgot, I should tack on the last part to all this, is that she handled her chips relatively comfortably. She seemed pretty comfortable at the table. So I didn't get the idea that this was just kind of somebody's girlfriend thrown in the situation, or that it was a player who satellited in. It certainly either is possible, but she seemed relatively comfortable at the table. So when she checks back, there's door number one, which is, all right, this is a check that looks something like this, not exactly this range, but it's relatively balanced. There's, more likely we're going to see hands like queens and nines. Those make, a lot of sense to check. We're going to see some 10x check a fair amount, but there's also going to be plenty of air checking. See a queen seven suited. What else do we see for the air checking? Even a mix of the 9-7 and 8-7, although not much, and then some ace highs. And then there's door number two, where it's just a couple of hands. Realistically, I don't know. She might be a very imbalanced player in this stage who just says, I have a hand that doesn't want to get check raised and that doesn't want to go three streets. Queens. And I check back. Jacks. You don't know at what stage someone is in their learning. And if they're doing something that you're not doing, and I am range betting the situation, then you have to do your best to make a model of how they play, because you can't project how you play onto them at this point, and you can't project what you believe theory is at this point. So, this low jack raise, I'm thinking there's an extra premium on this kind of sevens through queens territory and 10x, because many of us learned at some point moderate made hands make really good checkbacks. And it's a very easy sales pitch when somebody gives you that advice, why you would do it. You can kind of encapsulate that lesson in 1 minute and get, let's say, 70% of the info from it. So with that in mind, when I go to the turn, I'm going to think she has way less air than she's supposed to. And I'm going to think that she has way less king X than this simulation was showing us. There's already not very much, and I guess she can't have these, to be honest. So maybe not way less. That's not fair, but I guess it would be like king nine suited. So to be honest, I think this is reasonably accurate with the king, but not the air. So what do you guys want to do with the information as I'm seeing it in the situation? Are we betting? Are we checking? What size if we do bet? Let this go for a minute. So we've got bet 75, bet small, B50, B50. Large if we assume all the king X is betting flop, B60. Bet two blinds, donk B50, B60 to B80. Yeah, I think everyone is kind of all over what GTO Wizard likes in this situation. Turn, oh, I'm sorry, did I show you guys the turn? Yeah, I did, right? 3. And on the turn, my hand can check, or it can kind of bet medium, even though, it looks like a pretty polarized spot. Sorry, it's taking a moment to load here. But my hand is one of the few hands that can kind of sneak in at this like B80 size. And I don't think that's terrible. I think what would be really bad is checking, which is a very reasonable play in solver land. And part of the reason I think that's particularly bad is I don't think we're seeing delayed bluffs. There's a good chance she doesn't have a hand that wants to bluff almost at all in her range. And the other part to all this is I think that the delayed bluff line is not executed quite as well. So if big blind checks here, take a look at how she's supposed to play. It's not that aggressive a strategy, but there's a lot of these kind of delays coming from like Oh wait, sorry guys. I forgot this is on cutoff. Yeah, we're not supposed to be exploring this one. I meant to only bring this up at the beginning. This is moot at this point, but I have looked at the strategy on GTO Wizard. Sorry, at the GTO Wizard strategy against the hijack. If you do give it a check, even though it's a 0.01% check, and I don't know why this is not showing us this right now, but they I don't know why I won't show the bet anymore. Anyway, the point is they do like that mid-size bet here on the turn, even against the low jack. And I think that, like I said, it's not bad, but I want to go big here because I think there's a really reasonable chance she only has pocket queens, pocket jacks, 10x, 9s, 8s, and 7s. And I'm not so concerned about making sure that 8s and 9s have the highest percentage of calling me on the turn as much as I am really crushing the 10x that I think is never going to fold and getting max value out of queens and jacks. Because I think there's also something to be said, and some of this now, the exploit starts to land a little bit on me. But if you think that your opponent may be somewhat, not necessarily intimidated by you, but at least think that you believe you're a better player, and if you think, that you have it all, an aggressive reputation, which, the vast majority of pros do, and I believe that I probably held this reputation with her, the one line you really see the least amount of is check back flop on a high frequency betting board and fold to turn donk on an unaffecting turn. So with all the draws that are out here, I think there's very, very little chance I'm going to see a fold on this turn. And I think I'm good a massive percentage of the time, a fair amount higher than Solver believes. So I'm just going to blast. So I go around B150 here. I think I went B150, but this size looks a little smaller than that. Yeah, that looks like B125. The river comes a 5. I'll skip polling people on this one. At this point, I went for just over pot. I think I went B110. And the idea was I thought, hey, it's not like a lot of my bluffs got there necessarily, but 5-4 made a pair, whatever, 4-2 suited made something. It had some interaction. If the board paired a 3, I was going to pour the money in. Obviously, if the board paired a king, I was going to pour the money in. But on this river, I thought a more modest size, and I felt somewhere right around pot was pretty much a lock to get called by a 10, pocket queens, pocket jacks, etc. And I'll take a couple questions before I get to her reaction. If you think she stripped a king X, we have enough equity to B125, B200. Yeah, I agree. I'm with you. It's just a matter of trying not to push her off of those hands that we really want to get called by. But yeah, I mean, that's what I wanted was B150. I think B200, we're starting to risk some of those queens, jacks, etc. folding. And my belief is that on a lot of rivers, this one being one of them, she almost certainly won't be able to get away from a 10 or jacks or queens had she taken this line. So yeah. So let's see. How often do you see check raise in live tournaments on a board like this? Yeah, it depends. I think it's coming from Colombian saying good board to bet range large. Well, I think that's kind of a good reason that if you get under check raise, which I think there is probably this flop, like a lot of flops are getting under check raise bluffed, probably primarily by like the 6x group, which is not exactly a bluff, but that's a reason to lean into a higher frequency of betting, but it already is a range bet. But when you bet large, I don't think you're really helping in that situation. So she shoves. Some of you probably knew this was coming. What the hell do we make of this? And yeah, what do we think in this situation? Try and give you my thought process. Well, I go back to one of the most likely hands from a meta perspective on the flop was pocket kings. From a math point of view, absolutely not. Like, 2 kings are out of the deck. It's still a low jack opening range. Why are we going to put her on one combo? That's insane. But if we don't think we're going to see checkbacks on the flop, and then we do start to zoom in. We might be, working with 20% of range, but as I pointed out, we might be working with like 5% of her range if it's only those queens, jacks, pocket kings, etc. We don't know what world we're in. So kings comes to mind really quickly. After that, we say, what value would shove? Well, a straight. Okay, she doesn't have a straight. That's fairly obvious. A different set. Tens and sixes, I don't think anyone's checking those on the flop. That just doesn't happen in single raise pots, super deep stacked, closing the action. So that one's out. Pocket threes, yeah, no, that's definitely possible. And I did bet big enough on the turn that she might call. The only thing about pocket threes is, given that my respect is waning for her as a very good player, I think that's probably not super likely when she checked the flop, or it becomes less likely, I should say. There's still a chance she just calls threes. Even though I could tell you that against this bet size, threes are always good, I think a lot of people could reasonably assume, wait, if I do have the best hand, he's not calling anyway, and if I don't, I lose more chips, and I lose to straights and bigger sets. It would be a bad call, but I think it's precisely the bad call that a lot of bad players make. And then in addition to that, we can still say, even though I bet really large on the turn, there's still probably some frequency that she raises that set of threes on the turn. So again, we're working with maybe around one combo on the turn of pocket threes. And then pocket fives, that's a hell of a call to make on the turn. I wouldn't say it's impossible. Again, we just don't have enough of a baseline on this player. But then that same thing applies to, we're not positive she shoves the set of fives on the river. The last thing to say is, even if she raises, if it's a bluff, I think there's a really good chance it's a shove. And if it's value, one thing that bad players do here is they care way too much about getting paid, and they might just click it to like 30K. I might be seeing 28K, 30K, 35K. I think there's more numbers in play for the value than there are for the bluff. I think the bluff can come out of a few different areas. The bluff can come from the classic, if I shove here, he can only call with, and then fill in the blank. I have to have a set or better or something. That guides some people into a kind of kamikaze play that, has not always been kamikaze. That's, at different stages of poker been very effective for a lot of people, even though it doesn't, it's not grounded in theory. Then it could be, he's bullying me. I am a woman. I've been tight. He has been aggressive, or just he is a pro. I am a recreational. He's bullying. I have to push back. And that doesn't make much sense. If she has pocket queens or a 10, you just say, well, just call. But I think sometimes there's a spaz. Something happens. This person's pouring a lot of chips in, and most people don't have a very streamlined, logical thought process. I should add, the shove came after about 15 seconds, which, she could, in 15 seconds, shove threes or fives. But I think it starts to lean us a little more towards pocket kings and a bluff. And yeah, while I don't love my situation here, I do think it's maybe even a better hand to call with than 10-6 suited. Just that one blocker to the king, as silly as that may sound. But yeah, there's just enough worlds where I don't know what's going on with this person. I'm going to call in this spot like every time, because I think we need to jump through a lot of hoops to believe that it's value. And there's just always a chance that for whatever reason, she decides this is a spot to shove with a mediocre hand like a 10, or some random bluff, like maybe just has ace jack of hearts, something that's kind of nonsensical. So I'll show you guys what she showed up with. Ace two of clubs. And when I was running a stable and coaching a fair amount, and my friends were playing online consistently, I kind of had a policy that everybody show each other hands like this all the time. When you see something that was not on your radar at all, that you never could have predicted. Same thing, if this was pocket sixes, it would fall into the same category. Those are really important because we get way too sure of ourselves in poker. And when you're right, and let's say I, bet the river and she called and flashes me queens and then mucks, it's really easy to just be like, another check for me being a genius. Yep, knew exactly what the situation was. So we get humbled all the time in poker. There's not this physical barrier towards doing something kind of psychotic like we see here. And I always go back to, Nick Petrangelo had this moment like maybe 12 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, like 13 or 14 years ago, where he had not been successful in live poker at all. And he had a conversation with a friend of ours who was a middle-aged pro who just didn't look like a pro at all. And he hears about all the bluffs this guy's making and some of his friends are making. And Nick just has this reckoning like, oh my God, all these folds I've been making to people who look like you. And I was just like, sure they were right, and just kind of pitying myself for having to fold each time. I'm just going to keep calling from now on. And everything like kind of got better for Nick at that point when he just started calling and realizing that like sometimes people are all over the place, and all of your logical deduction is for naught, because I don't know, there's no analysis where I was going to have ace two of clubs going on here. So let me back up, see what we've got for input from the chat. Anything? They don't like being pushed around. Yep, that's true. I'm not sure if they is women or recreationals or people in general, but I'm on board with it. Yep. All right. Sorry if I missed any questions in here, but catch up. All right, we're going to go on to the next hand. All right, this is a pretty lame hand, but I wanted to put it in here just because not all exploits are so sexy as some of the ones to come. This one is pretty basic. This is the hand before break. It is Triton main event at the last stop, Monte Carlo. And the small blind is a recreational, really good, friendly dude. And he just has his cards in his hand. He's just like this by the time it goes to the cutoff. And he's being completely genuine. I know he's just going to go on break. The big blind is Mike Watson. And Watts is a great player. And I'm sure he's observant of this too. It's going to widen my opening range. I would open like a little bit lighter than if there was no small blind. I know this player. I know he's not fucking with me. This is not an act, especially this deep. It would be a very senseless one, but I mean, he's holding his cards like this. So I get to open much wider on the button. Pretty similar to how you would open button into big blind when there is no small blind, except for the fact that there's more money in the pot. So it's a little more lucrative. So this is a super wide range, but Mike knows that. Doesn't mean that I don't want to open light, but I just need to understand that, you know, some battles could come. He should be lighter for value on his 3-bets, more bluffing. This is not going to be a Jaffe explosion 3-bet, 4-bet type situation, but he defends. Flop is king, jack 3. I think most people here are probably going to understand that we're going to do, you know, some amount of checking. We have so much garbage on the flop. I mean, on the button. So nut advantage is not the whole story here. And I'm going to check this hand. It's going to be a struggle to keep going. I certainly could bet it, but I'll show you the rest of the hand. Turn 3, check, check, river, king, check, and oh my God, Jaffe check 9 high back. And whatever, I lose to ace 4. Here's the point. Like I said, not a very sexy exploit, checking down 9 high. But these situations, exploit isn't exactly the right term for this. It's more of a unique situation, but there's a slight exploitative angle. The unique situation is I'm crazy wide. This is going to play much more like a heads-up hand. And when you're playing heads-up, there is some checkdowns with hands that can't win, and you just kind of let it chop. You can't bluff everything because you have too many hands. Now, more often than not, this hand is going to have put money in by the river, but it's not 100%. And the exploit is in a situation where your opponent might think that they have special information, the special information being that I'm super wide, and might not account for the fact that I'm aware of that. I do think people are going to call lighter in these situations, and Mike is really sharp. So if this was a random player and I knew they weren't paying attention to this player, I would not check this down because I think I would be put on a normal range, and I wouldn't do this. But I do think this is a situation where people overcall in this situation. I don't know if Mike was live to call with, let's say, queen high, but I do think I was going to get called by, look, not this hand on the flop and not this hand on the turn, but on the river, I do think I was going to get called a lot, where I would imagine it's a mix in reality, for probably not being a great card to be holding. But yeah, that's where we're at with that one. Very basic. Moving forward. Just going to take a quick look at what we've got. I think this is an issue with a lot of players today. They see some blocker to some nuts and go ham when solver would be doing a 35. Yeah, I agree with that. Dean, LOL, 6'9". Yep. Hey, Dean, I have them putting together that recommendations list that you recommended for all the podcasts. The GTO Lab podcast, the guests make 3 recommendations at the end of the show, any kind. And yeah, we're compiling that. So that'll be somewhere on YouTube and probably on Discord. All right, next hand. And this is a hand truly without a small blind. This is Marius Kuzmanis, Lithuanian player, one of Ponikov's guys, to my knowledge. I had not played with him to this point, but I'm sure he's a good player who plays online and knows what he's doing. And this is a very wide open. I had Nick run it in PO for me. But first question I have is open, what we're seeing here, but do you guys play any limps in the situation? There's no small blind. We're pretty deep. Want to hear if anyone's playing limps here. And if not, curious if people want to say how wide they're opening pre-flop. If you want to give me a percentage or range. All right, we've got no limps, probably 80%. I never limp, haven't studied limps much. Lenny says tighter. I don't know if that's tighter than 80. No limps, maybe 60%. Don't limp this deep, probably opening like 70%. No limps, 65, 67. Yeah, it's lighter. What percent was this? Does it show here? Sorry, guys. Oh, wait, I got to share screen. Oh, yeah, we are seeing it. Oh, no, that's the river one. Sorry, guys. Here's the pre-flop range. I don't have the percentage up. Oh, no, that's flop frequency is 75%. Sorry, I'm bad at reading, and I don't know the percentage of range, but I believe we are close to 80, maybe slightly upwards. But you can see here's the kind of border, 750, 850, queen 30. It's very, very wide. Sorry, I don't think in terms of percentages. I ask you guys, but I need to convert that at some point for myself. But I've always thought about bottoms, which is not a good way to learn it. But yeah, and then here's also, while we're at it, the flop strategy. They're just playing. Nick ran this for me, tested for B33, and yeah, 75% frequency. I think that's a reasonable strategy. I think some people would over c-bet here, just in general. I think people over c-bet a lot of flops that are not particularly terrible textures from the button and cutoff, just kind of forgetting how loose they are. And yeah, here's a texture facing B30, thereabouts. My hand can definitely check raise. If you'd asked me going into it, I would have guessed that this is a hand that check raises 20% of the time. But I think because of what his range looks like with hands like 850 in there and 1070, we're doing even better. And this hand was check raising upwards of 60% of the time. I don't want to get lost in the solver. We're going to move on. So I think this is a pretty normal line. Turn, and we face the overbet. This is B130-ish, and I like that. This is a polarized situation, but we're not going to get into playing polar turns. This is about exploits. My hand, I think, is a very intuitive call. I don't imagine we fold them off any better hands with a check raise. This seems like a hell of a lot to shove, and we're doing just fine against bluffs. And I want to show the turn strategy. Nope, that's the river strategy. Sorry, back to it. Don't have the turn strategy up. Didn't want to have too much solver stuff going on here. River's an offsuit queen, looks dreadful, and I check. And we face 125K into 77.5. So let's start by hearing what people like in the situation. I don't imagine anyone's got me shoving. Do you like this bluff catch? Do you like fold? We think this is a good pro. What do people think about ace six of diamonds catching here on this queen river? KDR, how long have I been doing these on YouTube? This is my first webinar on YouTube for GTO Lab. I've been doing a podcast, but the strategy in that is more player hand breakdowns. There are a few previous webinars, though, that are not by me that you can find on the channel. But as Niels is saying under the GTO Lab moniker, this stuff is going to be getting moved to the coaching platform. So the free webinars are ending soon, but please sign up for our coaching. All right, so we've got just call, yeah, folding, randomize, cop out. Come on, if you were there for the first part, we don't love that. Don't randomize rivers. Just fold. It's likely to get over bluffed. Agree, diamond's not ideal. Fold. Call 7% of the time. Let me ask you, Dustin, why are diamonds not ideal? You may be onto something, but I'll come back to it. Adam says they call 7% of the time. Rather have a 10x or jack x of the diamonds here for a bluff catch. Dean says, don't think the ace of diamonds is bad. They're probably not bluffing with that. I agree with you, Dean. All right. Seems pretty mixed. We've got some folding, some calling. I'm hearing more folding now. And I'm hearing a fair amount about the ace of diamonds being a good card. Here's the interesting thing. I thought the ace six of diamonds was a decent catcher too. I thought ace of diamonds doesn't block bluffs. That's true. He's not bluffing with the ace of diamonds on the river as a really good player. That's a pretty quick mechanic to pick up on. But Dustin was right that the diamonds are not great. The six of diamonds, it took me a little while. Nick and I looked at this for a bit, and because I'd seen that ace six suited was overall a pretty good bluff catch, but specifically this combo was shit. This combo was catching something like 20% of the time. We'll come back to that, but ace six suited, the others were calling about 80% of the time. The idea was that this doesn't block as much two pair. That if you had, let's say, the six of clubs, we block 6-4 of clubs. And also the 9-6 offsuit might not be pure in his range here. So in this case, we don't block any combos of 9-6 suited. The diamonds were already blocked. So it blocks less two pair. It accounts for, what am I thinking, 3 combos, I believe, or 2 combos, but it's something in the grand scheme of ace-6 suited. That being said, I do like this call. And here's the idea behind this call. I think it's super easy to overbluff, as somebody mentioned earlier. I think on this Queen River, here's what we're seeing for his bluffs. There are, I skipped the turn. I didn't want to overload, but the turn strategy had some tough bluffs to find, namely Queen 3-0. That's a tough one, in my opinion. Queen 3-0 and Queen 5-0. But those are moot when we get to this river because, yeah, he's not going to bluff with a queen. That seems pretty standard to check the queen and just win a fair amount of the time. These were also kind of tough bluffs to find, ace 3-0, ace 2-0. Again, these small follow-throughs on the river are without a diamond. But I do believe if he gets to this river with these hands, he's probably going to follow through a lot. I think it's easy to say, hey, Button's the only guy with Jack 10. This is a load of chips we're putting in. Big blind, check raises a lot of king on the flop, and can still fold a king on the river. Let's just go for it with a lot of hands. But as I'm saying, I think these might check the flop a little more than Solver did, but mostly the turn barrel is relatively tough to find with these. I think it's possible. And I think it's much easier from an early position, hitting it with these if you're low jack or high jack, blasting the low suited ace. But where I think a player can really get carried away on the turn and on the river is over here. these are supposed to follow through a lot on the river, but they were quitting a lot on the turn. That's why these nodes got pretty short. They weren't using a different size. They were just checking the turn a fair amount, as were these. I don't think anyone gets to this river with 7-5 or 8-5 and then checks river. Also, if we go back to pre-flop, I believed, I mean, this is just my guess, but I thought 8-5-0 was going to be opening pure. Some of that is just projecting. I would have been a little bit looser than this on the button. I forgot to answer, but yeah, no limps. Good that most people weren't limping here, but I do see it occasionally where people see no small blind and even somewhat deep stack, they play a limp. You don't want to do that. I think even exploitatively, it's quite bad. And the advice I would give, if you are recreational or look like a recreational and a pro limps the button, anything deeper than 30 big blinds, I mean, honestly, probably at any depth, I would just pure raise garbage from the big blind. I would raise every hand. If you had aces or kings, I would go to 3 big blinds, and anything else, I would go to 5 big blinds. Big blind versus a pro's button limp. I don't think anyone is going to play a trap there. But yeah. Anyway, back to the situation on the river, and my belief is that people just aren't checking 8-7 like this on the river. That surely we're going to see the queen 10 find this check. And there might be a little bit more value in a couple areas. Like, even if I say, hey, these are hands, if these are more than just the diamonds, which I believe they are hitting the turn. Sorry, this is a screenshot. I'm Pio incompetent. Nick gave me these screenshots. But these combos, let's say it's, the old Jack 3 of clubs. Yeah, I think he's going to follow through on the river as said, but it's very few combos that I'm stripping out here because I do think he's, most of us are not hitting the turn with Jack 3 of clubs. So there are a few less bluffs coming from here, but it's all about offsuits. And if he has, twice as many of these hands, which I believe is pretty realistic, the bluffs just climb like crazy, and anything that was a 0 EV call goes way up in value. So that's my belief in this spot, is that this is a really nice hand to call. But I also really like what Marius did here, which is he's got 6-4 suited. That's a lot of value to go for with this hand. And that could be a product of looking to take advantage of me, that his read is I'm a station. That's the info that he's gotten. You can see here, this hand is not betting that big, the 6-4 suited. Solver is going with, what was that? Something like about pot, I think. So he goes pretty hard with the 6-4 suited, but I think it's great. You can see if you follow my logic, it's really good because I think people are going to have too many bluffs here. So I think it's pretty nice to get greedy. And then the last thing I'm going to say is kind of a metagame tell, which is he leaves 17K back, which it could be a bluff. But I think that oftentimes when you see a size like this on the river, where it's pretty intuitive if you're going to go this big to just put the rest in or leave the one chip back, maybe leave 1,000. That's pretty common in the high stakes, where if you have a bluff, whatever, you just fold to the shove. And if you have the right, whatever, you get to live with your bluff and have that one chip that's going to over-realize in the following orbit. But 17K is not the same. And what I think happens here a lot is he understands 6-4 suited is beat some portion of the time. I have some 2 pairs with either the 9 or the queen, and they will all beat him. He has the lowest 2 pair in the deck. But I'm not going to shove 2 pair here probably. It seems very unlikely. I don't know if I'm suggesting that if you face this bet, you, let's say, shove queen 6 of diamonds. That's dicey. I think, I probably wouldn't do that. But I will say there's a read to be had here. It's possible this is not balanced at all, and that this is exactly this kind of hand where it's the mid to low 2 pairs, where this is like 9-6 suited and worse. We know he doesn't have a 2 pair with the queen because only king queen, that's the only one that would have bet the turn like this. But I would say, just my read in general from populations, you're going to see a disproportionate number of low to mid 2 pairs, or better classified non-nut good value hands when somebody does this bet 80 to 90% of their remaining stack. I think it's pretty often that. And then, I think many people are familiar with the exploit that if this player is a pro and this player is a kind of clueless player, just kind of playing for fun, very often they'll do something like this to, let this person muck their cards so that they have some chips behind. And especially if this player is being put all in, they leave them 5 or 10% of their stack if they don't respect them, just to kind of let them save face and not bust on the hand. But yeah, those are my thoughts. So that would be the one thing. If I were to find a fold here, it would be for exploitative reasons about that bet size. To be honest, one thing I regret in this is that I snapped this, which there's no reason to snap it. Even if you feel really comfortable about that, why betray that information that you feel that way? I think that was my ego getting in the way. And then the other thing I would say is, when I snapped it, I didn't let myself consider the implications of this. I still feel really confident I would have called, but just kind of giving you the whole picture. So let me catch up, see if we've got any questions or messages. How do you approach bluffing from his perspective, since it's easy to overbluff here? Do you take into account that some higher level players will catch too much, for example? Exactly, yeah. So I'm definitely, great question. I meant to address this. If I'm in Marius's spot and I'm facing a non-elite player, I'm going to overbluff for sure on the button, because there's a chance, as we heard, like I know some really good players who were mentioning that they were only going to only open 60% of range on the button or thereabouts. And if that's the case, then we can kind of guesstimate maybe somewhere between like 55 to 70% is the average opening frequency. So it's probably not getting over open. So I might get projected as having a much tighter range than I actually do. That enables me to overbluff. So I would do that. But in the inverse, when this kind of, if the player is thinking as I am here, then you want to be careful and not overbluff. That would bring us back to this hand that I played against Watts, where I feel very confident he understands the situation fully, and I actually want to underbluff. But I think this is the less common situation, and we're going to find ourselves more often wanting to overbluff these spots, but still being somewhat careful. Martin says, having an ace in general is good. Should never bluff an ace with those wide ranges. Don't block any of his busted straight draws. Yeah, specifically the ace of diamonds. I will say, I was a little bit surprised that when you have the low offsuit ace, it's not ace of diamonds, it gets in there a bit, but still, that's in the grand scheme of things, very few bluffs. So I would agree. Just as a nice generalization, what Martin's saying, hits the nail on the head, which is bluff catching with an ace in your hand is often pretty good, because your opponent in many situations doesn't have a ton of ace-x bluffs on the river. Plenty of exceptions to that. All right, looks like there was a bit of a back and forth with that. I'm going to skip that for the moment. How about what he keeps behind? Yep, somebody nailed that. Martin says, how often do you call a king on the river? Always? Even the ones with bad blockers, like in theory? Yeah, that's a good question. So if I have a king on this river, let me see. Are there any king X I want to fold? No. Yeah, I would call. I think a king is still a better bluff catch, even at this size. Every king I can think of would be better than this hand, and I called this hand, and I feel pretty good about it. Yeah, you're welcome, Sahib. Thank you. Does it seem a little too thin? If he's value betting this, does he assume you're call heavy? Yeah, he does. And I think this is probably too thin against some people, but I think he knew his customer. I think that it's possible he just kind of like overplayed his hand, but it's more likely that this was targeted, and I got to give him hats off. I think it was really good. OR says, what's the pre-flop 3-bet range like? I do not have that screenshot on me, but it's a little wider. We're still super deep, so we're not looking to inflate too many pots out of position, so it doesn't go crazy. But as you can imagine, we widen up a little bit, value and bluffs. All right. OR says, we obviously cannot station all of them in theory, and you are right on, but this is an exploitative webinar, so we can do whatever the fuck we want. All right, next one. Next two hands are not hands I played. They are observed hands, and I kind of want to talk a little bit about the origins of exploits. where they come from, why, how you start thinking about them and synthesize the data that is right in front of you. This is a hand where this player was a reg. This was, I can't remember what buy-in this tournament was, but it was at least a 10K. I haven't played with this player in many tournaments lower than a 10K. And he's an old school reg and a great player, but he's not super current. He's very current for an old school player, but I'm still trying to constantly update my picture of him because I know he's studying and getting better, but he's also not playing online every day. He's not running a stable. He's not, running a coaching operation or anything. So I don't know exactly what he does and doesn't know at this point. And this hand helps me a little bit. I think of him as a nitty player overall, who under bluffs and, just has it a little too much, of course. Pretty much nit vibes across the board, but like very capable nit. And I see this shove. And I don't have a sim up, but I think you're going to be hard pressed to find any shoves in this situation. It's just not a theory play. And this player's a reg, so I don't think it's exploitative. Do I know what he has? No. I mean, he could have a 10, possibly has a 5. He could have a flush draw. He could have a combo draw. It could be that he was only shoving like a couple of absolutely seemingly perfect hands, 6-3 of clubs, 4-6 of clubs, what have you. But these days, really good poker players, especially the guys who play online day in, day out and find themselves with these shallow stack chippy V spots, they know that you play a lot of check raises here. You've got some crazy hands like 9-8 with a club or, Queen 4 with a club that are really interested in hitting them with a check raise. They certainly can't shove. They're losing at that. But going to 30K here is a nice play. And to complement this plethora of bluffs that are check raise folding, you need to check raise your value. Even a 5x check raises for value and just kind of gets it in chunk of the time, but definitely a 10x at a super high clip. So even without having seen his cards, I can say that this guy has not stepped up his check raise game, at least shallow stacked. And that's a really helpful bullet point. If I don't want to extrapolate to any other parts of his game, I could just simply say, hey, treat his check raise as a little bit stronger than normal. And when he's shallow stacked, maybe some of the spots where I'm supposed to mix check, I can just go ahead and put in a small bet because he's not going to be able to torture me with enough check raise bluffs. Therefore, it's going to overperform. But realistically, while that's a pretty direct, one-to-one exploit that I can kind of start to form around this play that I'm seeing, there are other not as firm exploits that I'm going to start kind of molding. I'm going to start saying, hey, just in general, a lot of the other things where I think I would have treated him as a capable nit, I'm going to continue to treat him as a capable nit. I would be surprised if this guy doesn't have any check raise with King of Clubs offsuit 4 in the next 2 years. This is not a, forever read on this player. It's a palimpsest, and you want to keep rewriting your views on people and updating them constantly. And especially the higher stakes you play, the smaller the fields are and the more you get to know your opponents. But certainly online, taking copious notes is a good idea. All right, let's take a quick look at chat. Anything? All right. We're going to the next one. Name and shame, please. Very nice. No. Lovable guy. So this is another observed hand, and I'm going to tell you about the villain. This is in a 3,500. This is 3,500 WPT at Hard Rock. And this player, I just got moved to this table. He seems like a 45-year-old dude wearing a Chicago Blackhawks hat for whatever that's worth. I don't know if they're the team of nits or lagtards, but the table is acting pretty quickly, and it folds to him in the low jack, not this hand, but this is my other data point going into this. Folds to him in the low jack, and he takes like 20 seconds. No one's taking more than 2 or 3 seconds on their opens. Just tanks, looks pretty pained, and then folds kind of pained. What do I make of that? Well, almost certainly he's not a great player. No great player is wasting 20 seconds in the low jack on an RFI spot. But I already assumed he's probably not great. Does it mean he's tight? No, not necessarily. Does it mean he's loose and he was sitting there with 6-2 suited and finally got the discipline to fold? Almost certainly not that. Is it just acting, trying to, protect himself? Could be some of that. But really good players don't feel the need to act by, in early stage of the tournaments, tanking for 20 seconds on an RFI. What it really tells me is he's trying to play well. He's thinking about the game in some way or another, because most of us, we're like 100 big blinds deep and don't really care. If you want to open a hand, open a hand. If you're, wrong, you were wrong by a pip and it's a very, very, low EV mistake. So most people just don't stress in that situation. So for whatever it's worth, I realize he's trying pretty hard. Then it folds to him on the button, and I cannot remember the blind level. It might have been 501K, to be honest, but he was about 100 big blinds deep. And what happened was he just took a bunch of chips and threw them in pretty quickly, and it ends up being 2.9x. And I could see is like, for the guy who took 20 seconds on the low jack, now it gets him on the button, and he snap acts, and he doesn't even know the size that he's putting in. So, okay. I'm going to say this guy's somewhat of a mess. He is pretty stressed out playing if he's going to take 20 seconds and fold in the low jack, and then he's going to act so quickly on the button and not count his size. So he's a bit of a wild card. Again, I don't know that this means he's tight or loose, but a lot of things could happen from this player, and he's almost certainly not a particularly good player. Big blind calls, 10-7-2 all hearts, check, B80. Most of us are playing small bets and checks on this flop. So this is immediately, alarm bells and 10A up. And I want to make note of this because even if I don't see this, it's some helpful information. In this case, this guy calls and then he blasts an offsuit king turn. Both bets came in really quickly. This guy folds. He actually shows a 10. He kind of folds quickly and the other guy mucks. That's all we've got. And I will explain what I take from this situation. If I'm trying to develop some quick exploits that, feel pretty solid, I would say that in general, I'm going to, when I see smaller bets from this guy, treat them as a little bit looser than I would from a top player, because in some spots, say this one, a top player might only play B33 in check, but he might be sizing according to his hand. This might be his size with a flush or pocket twos or ace of hearts offsuit jack, but he has an entirely different size if he's got black fours or 7-8 of spades or, all sorts of hands, ace-9 of diamonds. And I will say the player who uses this size on the flop and then kind of hits the turn like this with ace-5 of clubs, he's not in the tournaments very long. You learn about those players really quickly, and have been, a little bit of time, and he seemed pretty reasonable. So I'm leaning towards this is very high equity. If I had to guess, I'd say probably a little bit less flushes, and if it is a flush, it's probably a low one. But I think what we're seeing a lot of is like on the flop, jacks through aces and maybe set of sevens, set of twos. And then once he bangs the turn that hard, I would say the flushes are a little more likely and probably still pocket aces a fair amount of the time, and then the sets, twos and sevens. But then the bluffs are super oriented towards ace of hearts. I think you're seeing a lot of ace of hearts X, which, of course, as we know, is a really bad strategy for that to be the only one that you're using there, because then when hearts come, players can overfold to you very easily. So again, don't know too much, but another thing I would say is, let's say this guy opens under the gun and gets 3 flatters, and the flop is a king 7-2 rainbow, and he checks from under the gun. I'm going to treat that check way different than I would a pro, because everything I've seen from this player so far tells me he is not particularly well studied, or certainly not trying to follow theory. So many players who haven't done much studying just kind of believe simple heuristics like, if you're the pre-flop aggressor, continue with a continuation bet on the flop, and they ignore the fact that they've got 3 flatters, maybe 2 of them in position, where reg is very cognizant of that and checking, possibly range in that spot, if not 80% of range. So situations like that, when somebody is willing to put in a lot of money in spots where good players are not putting in a lot of money, take note of when they don't put in money and kind of leverage that. That's the simple exploit. But even bigger than that, back to kind of the PowerPoint of this presentation, is take note, practice your ability to synthesize this information. Don't just judge it immediately and write it off as bad. Even if you don't like the play and are never going to implement it into your game, you want to develop an understanding for how he's coming at the game. The best exploitative play is coming off of a branch of empathy. You need to understand why someone's doing what they're doing. And to understand that, on a deeper level, you often want to understand why they're at the table, because it's too basic to say everyone's at the table to win. Many people are at the table to cash, and other people are at the table to not embarrass themselves, and other people are at the table to make sure that they, you know, make as many flushes as possible and get in there with their suited cards. But we're not really all there for the same reasons. And I think that tends to infect a lot of players' thinking, where they're projecting that everyone is trying to maximize EV, which is rarely the case. All right, let's see if there's anything here. Blackhawks fans are used to winning. Yeah, they are a good team, aren't they? Let's see what else. All right. This is a hand against the legendary Gambledore. I'll tell a story, actually. So this was the main event in Monte Carlo, which came right after the 200K. And Gambledore had just gotten second to Patrick Antonius. And he and Antonius had both hopped in late to the main. It's 250 starting, and Gambledore ran it up real quick. There was this crazy hand where, so he was all over the place and showing wildness, in a great mood. I mean, he's always in a great mood, but making no qualms about it that he was here to gamble and to see flops and play. And this hand happens where Fedor opens, I want to say cutoff, and Vladimir defends big blind. Flop was, I'm going to get it slightly wrong, but hopefully I get the gist of it. 8-2-2 rainbow. Vladimir checks. Fedor continues for around B25, and Vladimir shoves 50 big blinds, thereabouts. And, you know, the whole table, we're all having a good time. We're laughing, and we're just like, oh my God. And he's just laughing and looking at Fedor with a big smile. And Fedor's just like trying to puzzle this out. Like, what the fuck do I do here? I think it was like 10-4-4 rain, something like that. 10-4-4. And Vladimir's just like, oh, whatever you do, you know, it'll be great. You know, you do you, you're fantastic. And Fedor is just like, kind of looking for some help. And Vladimir says at a certain point, he's like, I will tell you what to do if you will do it. And Fedor's like, I don't know about this trick kind of thing, kind of trying to figure out, like, what do I do with this? And then Vladimir, he says, will you do what I say? Because if you'll do what I say, I'll tell you. And Fedor eventually goes, yeah, I'll do what you say. And Vladimir goes, I think you should call. And Fedor goes, call. Immediately calls. I'm going to get it slightly wrong, but I think they both have ace high. Vladimir has like ace 5, and Fedor has like ace 3, something like that. It was a situation where they were almost always going to chop, but I couldn't believe Fedor's call. It was incredibly ballsy. I don't know if it was good or not. I mean, Vladimir was telling the truth. He believed that, I think, all of Fedor's calls would have him beat. They ran out of chop, but that was one of the more fantastic 125K tournaments hands that I've seen. So this is all on the heels of that. Here's where we're at, is a couple orbits after that. He's having a great time. He's drinking, and it goes open and a flat. He's not V-pipping like crazy. I should point out Vladimir is maybe playing 1.5x as many hands as you would expect, you know, card distribution should be. So it folds to me in a small blind, and I'm just going to address this really quickly. I think this is a situation that live cash guys are very familiar with, and online tournament players maybe don't get as much experience with. Live low stakes tournament players being kind of the middle ground, which is, don't be logical in a situation like this. This is there are plenty of situations you'll find yourself in poker, usually not in high rollers, but just in general, where you're not trying to out clever people. You're not trying to outthink them. It's okay that all the other pros at the table know what you're doing. I'm not going to play 6-5 suited like this. It's just probably not a good idea. But I'm going to put way too much money in with my premium hands that squeeze in the situation. And the thing about it is, yes, I want his action, but not really at all costs. Playing out of position against a complete wild card here, it's not as lucrative as it seems when I have a hand that's basically never going to be able to fold. It kind of gives him not a free roll, but a situation where whenever he outflops me, we're going to get the money in. Like maybe ace 7-2 rainbow, I can bet small and fold to a shove. But, you know, if flop goes, so I'll just give you the quick, you can see what SPR is here. If instead of queen 10-6, this is ace 6-5 with a flush draw, I'm going to bet small. And if he shoves, that's a really, really close spot. And I don't think I'm really making or losing money with a call. Like I just genuinely don't know. And that's the idea, you know, even to a greater degree if I have jacks or queens here. But I think when you expect this guy's going to call way too much and it's not super size sensitive, just put way too much money in. And I think a lot of people, you know, who play in tough games, they're a little too used to being sustainable here. They don't want, you know, these guys, or especially this guy, to know that they have a huge hand and be able to make a big fold against us. But I think he already understands that I'm not going to be squeezing light here. Not out of position. Maybe here. That seems reasonable. But yeah, just play the spot you're dealt. That was the short of it. It's just put a lot of money in when you know your opponent's going to call. This is especially applicable to early stages. For what it's worth, he asked me, what do you want me to do? I don't think all in was an option. It was call or fold. And I said, I don't know if it's legal for me to tell you what I want. And I kind of looked around the table, and then eventually like he kept being like, just tell me. And I looked around the table and got a couple of head nods. So I said, call, and he called. And then, yeah, B33 flop, he ends up folding. But yeah, crazy situations happen most often when you're like 1 to 200 big blinds deep at the very beginning of re-entry tournaments, in, you know, low stakes buy-ins, and just take what's being handed to you. Don't worry about being balanced. Don't worry about being clever. It's okay that the other really good players know what's going on. All right, moving on. How am I doing on timing? Unban Cayenne. 138. Yeah, Kahan is definitely someone who knows. Put a lot of money in when they're going to give you it. Don't cheat yourself. So I should probably pick up the pace a little bit. I think I only have 2 hands left. This is a situation against a capable recreational, early in a Triton. He opens. Thought this was hijack. I think he opened hijack. I think we got this hand a little wrong. He's here. Not a huge difference. I 3-bet ace queen suited small blind. Get the call. King queen 5. I'll show you what Wizard's doing here. I'm not going to pull the audience on this one. Whoops, where am I? This is a strategy they're playing. Let's see my particular combo, one of the better checks. If I had it back, I like kind of middling these sizes here. I think around a B15 is probably the best play. That's probably a longer explanation than I'll get into here. I end up checking, which I don't like. It's not a huge deal, though. I think it's fine to just kind of like even B10 range here, in theory. I think you're not going to be putting in too much money if you do that. And I think it would be silly to play bigger than a B25 on this flop. But yeah, B10 range is just kind of like a nice sustainable strategy that gets a little money in and starts to create some indifference with maybe 15% of his range, without betraying what you have. Because I think if you play a check here, it's easy to check this hand, easy to check pocket nines, and you're often not going to want to balance by checking pocket queens or a flush in hands like that. And I think even not very good players can kind of read that on you a little bit. And with that in mind, I faced this bet. I faced B40. And I want to hear what people like in this situation. Do you like calling, folding? I'm going to take check raise off the board. That seems a little preposterous. But yeah, do people like call, fold? What we got here? The C11335, your donkey emoji looks way too much like a goat. You should get that fixed. Let's see. So we've got call, 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 can't fold, call, call, call. Yeah. So I folded, and I want to talk about it. Let's take, Dean said, must be a fold if everyone's calling and this is an exploit. Yeah, unless the exploit comes later, but you nailed it. I kind of thought people would suss that out and I'd see more of a mix, but I kind of figured everyone would call here. Here's Wizard's strategy facing the check, for what it's worth. We'll take a look at this in a minute, but I want to show you how they're responding. They don't have a B40. Here's B25. My hand's going to pure call. Pretty straightforward. Here's B50. My hand's going to start mixing. I think it's a fair assumption. This is not always true, especially on rivers when combos are more delicate. But on the flop, I think it's a fair assumption to just kind of say like, all right, well, he bet a little bit less than this, but more than B25. Maybe my hand finds some folds, but is certainly a majority call. But it's got to be close. So even at equilibrium, we're not talking punt. Here's why I think it's kind of an easy fold. The value is going to bet far too frequently. That's my first thing. We are quite deep. Now, it's only SPR 3, but the hand started, what was this, 100 and change bigs? And I think there's not going to be enough slow plays. This, I don't think, is going to slow play nearly enough. Granted, I think he might 4-bet a little bit more than this pre-flop with the queens, but not by much. This, I think, is a moot point. I don't think he's going to have pocket kings, certainly not at this frequency. The aces are such a small node anyway, we can pretty much ignore it. But what it really comes down to are the flushes. Take a look at ace-10 of diamonds. I don't expect we're seeing an 80% check from ace-10 of diamonds. Jack-10 of diamonds, 50% check. Again, all these ace-high diamonds, this one bets 50-something%. But in general, once we get down here, these ones are betting more often. But I think we can say something like, even 7-6 of diamonds checking 30%. I think this is going to check like 10% at most. 8-7 of diamonds, you can see, these ones are averaging somewhere around 60% betting. But I think his flush is going to bet way too often, which is starting to make the bet stronger than Wizard believes in this situation. Now let's talk about the bluffs. I think he can find these bluffs. I think we're going to see maybe about this frequency of 4s and 3s bluffing like this. That seems relatively fair to me. But I don't know that we're going to see this much 7-6 of spades, 7-6 of hearts, etc. It's possible. That's probably not that unrealistic. I wouldn't go that far from it. These moderate hands, I don't think we're seeing jacks and 10s. I don't bet jacks and 10s almost ever here. Maybe if we're like twice as deep and I can see more value in turning them into massive bluffs later on. But I think these are going to check a lot. Ace Queen is doing really good against those. And then this is a group over here that I think is really tough to bluff as much as solver wants. I don't know that ace 4 of hearts is just finding, because again, remember what we're talking about, not just to find a stab, but to go B40. B40 is probably not giving up, and I just can't think of all that many times where somebody kind of donked their tournament off by going 3 streets with ace 4 of hearts here. It could be that they're doing a lot of betting and giving up, but that doesn't really ring true for me either. I just don't know. Once we get up here, solver's not using these either. But the big one for me is king queen. King queen in solver land here, checking 60% of the time in GTO wizard land. I don't buy it. I think we're probably going to see this betting like 85, 90% of the time. This one looks similar except for this. So just in general, to be really simple about it, I think there are slightly less moderate hands that I'm doing really well against, way more big value, these 3, and then flushes. And then less of these kind of like, this doesn't add up to too much. We're talking about 6 combos that are bluffing 50% of the time. It's maybe 3 bluffs here. This could work out as pretty proper. But in a situation where we're talking about only 130 combos, that tilts things really quickly, and it looked like equilibrium was already really close. The tack on to all of this is that I'm just going to let him win too much if he is bluffing. I have a hand that doesn't proceed well at all. So obviously I'm going to be folding on any diamond turn, but you'd have to imagine solver is sometimes just calling down with my hand with these ace queen of clubs. And if I believe from the start that he's under bluffing, and I don't think it's just to kind of give up turn, I'd say cut your losses right here. But I think it's easy to kind of fall into a position of, hey, this hand is too strong to fold. I know I should call. That's a good position when you're talking single raise pots, like big blind versus anywhere. I think that really is super helpful for people who don't float wide enough in the big blind. But in a 3-bet pot, 3-1 SPR, if you know you're going to be folding later, I'd say ditch it now. And I think when we look at this, people are going to be way too value heavy on this bet. All right, take a look, see if we've got any debate in the chat. Whatever Kahan would do is the correct play. What would you do, Kahan? I guess you don't know the villain, but you can use the info I have. All right. Are we c-betting ace king without a diamond? Yeah, I think if we go back to it, I kind of want to B15 my range in this spot. I think that would have been ideal. Maybe okay to have like cheated if I had some 9-10 of diamonds and bet a little big against this opponent, because I don't think he was going to put in too much with bluffs. We did the kings. Is there any more? All right, this is the last hand. This is more of a fun hand, more than a super learning hand, but yeah, we've arrived at the end here. This is me sitting on a nub. Got an open. This is a recreational and the cutoff. He's aggressive, definitely trying hard and looks for good spots. Button calls. This is a reg. Seems super close. I think like, yeah, 9-4 definitely folds, 9-5 close, 1 big blind, 9-6 seems like a call to me. Definitely not my area of expertise. This is, you know, the online guys are really good at short stack chip EV spots. Yeah. Check, check, check. Is the exploit to start donking here? No. Check. 40K. Fold. And I put it in. So why the hell did I do this? Yes, it worked. Awesome. That's great. Yes, I windmilled it because, hey, come on. It's 6-9. But the idea is, I think it's super easy to overbluff this turn. And this size, I'm not saying it's not a size you should use. I think that looks pretty good for like Queen of Hearts and Ace of Hearts. Seems fine. I think it's probably overdoing it for any heart above that. But it's so easy. The bluffs are, there's no end to them. Anything that is, let's say, less than a 7, I mean, theoretically, he could take black 5s if he wanted to and bluff them. But realistically, just anything unpaired that's not a heart. And he's the cutoff. And that's super easy. And he can overrate how often this player is checking his high equity hands, his hands that have a heart. He can also rationalize that, hey, even if this player has 6s with a heart, yeah, he calls me on the turn, but I can get him off on the river. Like, this guy theoretically can fold pretty much anything that's not the ace or queen of hearts by the river. And I don't have the ace of hearts almost ever. I overcalled off 10 big blinds, and I don't have the queen of hearts terribly often. And it's possible that with any of those, I bet the turn. But what he's thinking is, hey, it's 40K. If no one has a heart, they fold. Even if this guy has a heart, I might get him to fold the river. And you know, this guy checked once, this guy checked once, let's go for it. I think that that is enough logic for a lot of players who are not trying to be balanced in the situation and are not studied in the situation. And on my side, yeah, I'm mostly using that thinking, but I'm also just saying, wait, I'm putting in 89K to win 130. And I think this only doesn't work if this guy has the queen of hearts, ace of hearts, maybe jack of hearts. It's almost certainly this guy's too good for this just to be like 8s with the 8 of hearts. I don't think that's what we're going to see almost ever. And yeah, I mean, he took 2 seconds and folded. It's super, super easy to overbluff here. Obviously, you look like a huge clown when this doesn't work. And that goes back to the early part of the presentation, which is be okay with that. If you play an exploitative style, people are going to talk shit on you. You're going to have hands, sometimes hands that are successful because they might not have been good, or they might have only been a little bit good, but other people don't know what to make of them. And if they're not in your inner circle, you're going to get more shit talk than you're going to get praise. So I think you kind of got to live with that. If your goal in playing poker is to be thought of as a really good player, exploitative poker, for the most part, is not a very good cost benefit calculus. I think, especially in highly technical games like tournaments when they're 40 BB and lower. Certainly in live cash streets, there's a lot more respect for an exploitative style. But, this one, whatever, I put in, I don't know, 8 big blinds or something. But in other spots, you're going to tear a stack down in a way that maybe no one else would have. And there can be a lot of shame and tough feelings around that. So here's my attempt to try and help you kind of clear that hurdle. That's all I've got for hands. I didn't take as many questions as I'd hoped to. So let me, if anyone has any questions about anything from the presentation or exploits, let me give it a few minutes to let those come in and respond. Yeah. I was going to say, why am I forgetting your name? Salah. Salah asked, would I take any hand here? Yes, I would. Any hand except for a heart. If I had a heart or if I had 2 pair, I would have called to try to induce river. I see no benefit in shoving. I mean, as is, my shove makes no sense. Like, I think if you put this in a solver, it would only play calls and folds. My hand being a pretty clear fold. That would be my guess. I don't see why there would be any shoves. Doesn't matter to me that it's illogical. Somebody say nobody laughs at Kahan. He's one of the funniest guys. Gotta laugh at Kahan. No, I'm not leaving one chip behind because I think it's a bad investment on the off chance. This guy's pretty ballsy, and if he just goes for the rebluff, that's fucking sick. I think it's a bad investment to leave one chip. Dennis and Orpin, that was my thinking. Yeah, I am going to do more of these. I don't think, there we go. Niels is in there on the GTO Lab moniker. We're not going to be free, but the next installment of this will be on our coaching platform, and there's a New Year's deal going on, which, okay, it says it already in there. Are you always playing exploits or only when you have enough info? Always playing exploits. If you happen to miss the early part of the webinar, Zach, I would say that there's different levels of exploits. Often it's just exploiting frequencies. Sometimes like this, yeah, this is a crazy exploit. But other times it could be as simple as, like, if we were to take a look at this king, queen, 5, is it an exploit to take 7, 6 of diamonds and go B25 when the rest of your range is going B10 maybe? Well, no. In isolation, B25 is fine, but if you know how you're playing the rest of your range and you're playing B10 with the rest of your range, that is an exploit. That's the kind of exploit that I think we're all implementing from time to time, and that I would definitely do. Let's see, what else do we have? Yeah, my pleasure, Victor. Thanks, guys. Yes, I still do offer one-on-one coaching. Kahan, if you're listening, I'd be happy to help. Let's see. Yeah, my pleasure, guys. You seen anyone pull off that bluff where they got someone off the one chip? Oh, Chance went for it. Yeah, great question, Ryan. There was a spot. It was like in the 250K or something, maybe 2 years ago. Someone else will know this hand history, but Dan Smith puts all but one chip in on the river. He did have value, but it wasn't the nuts. And I don't know how long Chance took, but Chance shoved with a bluff to try and get Dan to fold with one chip, and unsuccessful. But I mean, I think you probably could have guessed where that would come from. He's a pioneer. I'm right there with Chance, brothers in arms. All right. Thank you, guys. Appreciate you tuning in. And yeah, I had a good time, and I hope you'll join me for part 2, which probably be within a few weeks on the GTO Lab platform. There's a webinar section. See you guys.